Hello everybody. Let's talk about metaphors for human cognition. This is lecture at 4.3. So we're kind of coming out of the social cognition area and we're looking to describe people and how they perform as thinkers, right? How they perform as problem solvers. So what is a metaphor? Well, I mean, it's a figure of speech, right? It's intended to clarify and observe phenomenon by referring to an object that shares similar qualities or purpose. And I'll give you some examples here. Psychologists evolved various metaphors for human cognition to clarify the motives of the purpose that underlie thinking. Think about it, right? Because we can ask, well, why do we think at all? What is the purpose of that, and what motivates us to think, right? These metaphors answer the question, what's the purpose of human thought? At least they attempt to some extent. Now, a brief history, if we look at cognitive psychology and social cognition, were pretty potent forces through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Cognitive scientists were fascinated with computers, and they likened the human mind, to a computer. That is, there's inputs, right? And then there's software that processes the inputs, including what is remembered as memory, and then comes with some kind of output. And the output can be in form of speech, behavior, thoughts, ideas, what have you. So if we advance that metaphor, which is so popular in the 60s through the 80s, that the social cognitive psychologists, and I'm kind of using that term loosely, right, described human information processing as conforming to these purposes. That ultimately we want to arrive at accurate conclusions, right? We want to minimize errors. We want to reconcile inconsistencies. And remember, this goes back to Dunning and the executive, right? That there has to be coherence was the third principle that Dunning had advanced. And then, but also we are bargainers, traders, and we want to maximize our gain and minimize our loss. So we want to get something for the cheapest price possible, or we want to expend the least effort for the most bang. So we're sensitive to these. And the implied motives then, if you look at this, is to come to accurate conclusions or to come to transactions where we come out on top, that is, we maximize our gain. And if we're looking for metaphors, then we could be compared to scientists or economists, because economists are about understanding, loss and gain, and scientists want to come to accurate conclusions. So we say, well, what is human thought like? And the social cognitive psychologists back in the 60s and 70s would say, well, people are like intuitive scientists. They want to come to an accurate conclusion. They test propositions, they test ideas, and then based on the information that they derive, they come to a conclusion which they hope is accurate. And same with economists, that is, what do people engage in? Well, they engage in cost-benefit analysis. They want to know what is going to lead to the greatest gain and the lowest loss, and that's probably the behavior they'll adopt. But then we see that human behavior and human thinking often doesn't achieve those goals. Often people support inaccurate ideas or inaccurate conclusions and they cling to them. Remember, beliefs as possessions. It's not about accuracy, it's about the fact that it's mine. Or people will do foolish things, right? Like, I remember I had a friend who said, oh my God, he had this ancient Dodge Intrepid. It was like a 94 Dodge Intrepid, right? And the transmission went out. So I said, what are you going to do? Going to get a new car? And he says, nah, I've been shopping around. I found a transmission for $2,400. I'll just put a transmission in it. And I tried to explain. I said, but what's the car worth right now? Blue Book, if it was running, it might be worth $800. And I said, so you want to put a $2,400 transmission into an $800 car, and after you put the $2,400 transmission into the $800 car, the car will still be worth $800. You'd be better off maybe putting the $2,400 towards a different car, right? But he couldn't see that, right? So I'm saying this guy is not an intuitive economist. If he is an intuitive economist, if I want to look at him that way, he's fallen short. He's making a grievous error, right? Well, Phil Tellock, who's my first advisor at Ohio State, really spent 20, 30 years in a research program trying to demonstrate that sometimes people don't behave as intuitive scientists or intuitive economists. Maybe their behavior more typifies or is better explained by a different metaphor. And so he advanced three metaphors. And because Tellock is so clever in his turn of phrase, I mean, I love this, deviant functionalist metaphors, that is, let us look at people not as scientists necessarily or economists, but maybe we can look at them in another way that explains that what appeared to be an error might actually be a motivated strategy. So we're getting back to this idea, right? That human cognition is essentially functional, and there's a lot of people that support that idea. But to say that accuracy, right, or maximizing gain and minimizing loss are the only motivations that are available, people might have different motivations. So Tellock spent a good long time, like 20, 30 years, developing this research program. I researched a very small part of it, as did many of us, contributing to the overall kind of theoretical stance. So where we may label a cognitive outcome as an error from the perspective of intuitive scientist or economist, errors may be reframed as strategies if we operate comparing people with a different metaphor. And here's a little bit about Tellock. The article itself, here's a link to one of the articles, the Social Functionalist Framework for Judgment and Choice. And this is people as intuitive politicians, intuitive theologians, and intuitive prosecutors. So I'm going to take each one of those in turn. So notice, we've gone from intuitive scientists and intuitive economists. Now we've added three more that allow us to look at people as prosecutors, theologians, or politicians. And here's some of Tellock's work. He's written a billion books, not that many, but counterfactual thought experiments and work at politics. One of his big things now, because he's over at University of Pennsylvania, is expert political judgment. How good is it, and how do we know? And they have competitions now to look at judgment, and that would be the super forecasting tournaments that he operates. So he's an amazing advisor. He was here for my first 3 years, and then he left. He went to Berkeley to head up the Haas Business School for a while, and then now he's in Pennsylvania. So let's take first look at one of these deviant functionalist metaphors, the intuitive prosecutor. And the intuitive prosecutor then doesn't necessarily want to come to an accurate conclusion. That's not on their radar. That's not one of their motivations. When the intuitive prosecutor's mindset is activated, really what they're about, their motivation is to right perceived wrongs, right? To reestablish control when control is perceived to be lacking. So we've seen a good example of prosecutorial behavior. That is, with the riots that we've seen, all right, what we see is people protesting, and largely protesting peacefully. There are exceptions, right? And there's also people pretending to be protesters to stir the pot. That's a whole nother issue. But notice how hard some cities clamp down on the protesters. They come in with armored vehicles to unarmed protesters. They bomb them with tear gas, right? They beat them with batons, etc. They clamp down severely. And this is research, this is the area in which I worked. Often you can see that people who are in the prosecutorial mindset believe that the world is spinning out of control and they must clamp down. And sometimes you have to come down pretty strong to reestablish control, and you're justified in doing that, right? We see in the Philippines, what's happening? Well, the president of the Philippines says drug use is out of control. It's destroying our society. So now they actually go out and they kill drug dealers and drug users. Well, that's against the law, but it's justified for the greater good. The end justifies the means. In a courtroom, what this might mean is, wow, this crime is out of control, and I have a defendant sitting there who committed this crime, and we have to clamp down to reestablish our society and the control in our society. He's offering an alibi, but notice, I might not call it an alibi when the intuitive prosecutor mindset is activated. I might say, yeah, that's a likely excuse. And notice that simple turn of phrase from alibi to excuse. Excuse I can ignore. Alibi I should take into consideration. So it's this kind of mental flexibility and this mental gymnastic that allows me to call this a motivated strategy. We're going to clamp down because we need to clamp down. We believe that's necessary. And notice the Rucker et al. Research I talked about earlier, we were testing the intuitive prosecutor model. That is, when people believed crime was out of control, they came down harder on the defendant for that crime. And those are people who, now, these people are not acting like intuitive scientists, and if we measure their performance, their thought patterns against an intuitive scientist, we'd say they're making errors. What Tellock was saying is maybe they're not making errors, maybe the error was in applying the wrong metaphor. When we apply the intuitive prosecutor metaphor, their behavior suddenly becomes quite clear, and their motivation is apparent, right? And we can begin to construct a logical narrative of why they're behaving the way they are. So, another then intuitive, the intuitive theologian. And in this case, what's going on with the intuitive theologian when someone enters into this mindset, and notice, someone can be in this mindset their whole life, it could be like chronic, or something can happen to cause them to enter into this mindset, some kind of situational force that may be temporary. Now, the intuitive theologian really believes that moral values have a sacred quality, that is what I believe to be right, to be moral, right, to connect me with my deity or whatever, then has this sacred value. And because it's sacred, it can't be challenged, because to challenge something that's sacred is frickin' blasphemy, right? And often there's no negotiating, there's no talking to people once they've entered into this mindset. It's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because the book says it's wrong, or because this leader says it's wrong, or God says it's wrong. Right? So it's a very stringent mindset in this regard. People who are in the theologian mindset then tend to fear encroachment from outside secular forces. People who do not share my faith can't tell me what to think or believe because they're wrong. They're simply wrong because they're not of my faith, and my faith is correct, right? So we can see this kind of theologian mindset. They experience outrage at those potential threats, and often when they're exposed to these threats, they require cleansing for even thinking about the heretical notion. So they might drop to their knees and pray to God, God, please forgive me for even thinking that thought, right? And you know, the extreme view of this might be where someone engages in self-flagellation, that they've sinned and they must now whip themselves, right, to cleanse their soul of this sin, right? So decisions that represent taboo trade-offs won't even be considered. And if someone believes that, let's say, the life of an infant is sacred, and we have a hospital that's at capacity, right? And the hospital is not only at capacity, but the hospital doesn't have the funds to, let's say, offer this infant who's severely ill the treatment they need. Maybe the parents don't have any money, and the cost of treating this type of case might be $25 million before it's all said and done. And we say, the hospital just can't afford in the budget this $25 million, right? See, now I'm talking like an intuitive economist. I'm doing cost-benefit analysis. A single infant costs us $25 million. I don't think it's justified. But to a theologian, right, that says all life is precious and sacred, they can't even enter into this conversation. I mean, this conversation is well beyond what they're willing to even consider, right? Life for money then becomes a taboo trade-off for these people. Taboo trade-off means I'm not allowed to consider it because of the the sacred nature of these ideas. Okay. So, and you can see right to life and right to choice often touch in kind of theologians from both ends, if you will. Now, the intuitive politician just says people seek approval from multiple constituencies. So if I'm a politician, I got to gather a coalition. I got to get these people on board. I got to get those people, right, if I want to do the stereotyping. But I have to maintain the approval of all these people. That's job one. That's the number one motivation, is to gain approval. Right? So decision making then often represents a compromise to maximize my appeal to all these different groups. Right? And then I might need to say to this group one thing that contradicts what I'm saying to this group. And at the end of the day, I got to be able to justify these different statements to these different groups that really represent different opinions. And I might go through all kind of cognitive gymnastics to make it okay. And this is where you hear the spin from politicians and you start going, oh, come on, spare me this crap, right? So one of the behaviors that we observe in the intuitive politician is anticipating potential objections. So the intuitive politician looks ahead and says, this group will object if I say this group will support it, this other group will object. So how do I say this in such a way to minimize all the potential objections? Notice, truth has no more value. Data has no more value at this point. What has value is trying to say the things that please the people who will either donate money to my campaign or what have you. And notice, this isn't necessarily just about politicians. It's going to be about someone at the workplace who's seeking promotion, right? They may say these different things to different groups to ensure their climb up the ladder. So don't take the metaphor title too literally. It's not just about politicians, although they're a great example of it. So I got a summary table here, and I hope this helps clarify things. If we look, the metaphor scientist, what is their motive? Accurate understanding. What is their response? They employ scientific methodology to try and figure it out, right? The economist, they want to maximize gain, minimize loss. Their mechanism is going to be some form of probably cost-benefit analysis. But now let's get down to the prosecutor, right? Their main concern, their motive is to maintain or restore order when they believe it's been eroded. And they generally do this through increased punitiveness. That is, increasing punishments, less willing to listen to excuses, alibis, etc. The theologian, what do? They protect sacred values, wherever those have come from, right? And moral cleansing. And then the politician, they seek approval and they please audience and defend the self as the behaviors that we'll see them demonstrate. So what I want you to do, this is assignment 10 then, right, is we've discussed via the lecturette Metaphors for Human Cognition. I'd like you to describe two conversations that demonstrate two different goals, and that's one goal per conversation, so you'll have to come up with two. These can be conversations that you have with another person, or examples come from social media, television, etc. However you want to do that. Please briefly describe the conversation and then describe what you believe to be the goal behind the conversation. What is this person trying to accomplish? What is their motive? And here are your potential goal motivation for this assignment, right? So be specific in your explanation of the goal so I don't have to guess. So tell me what metaphor you're applying in your observation and then tell me the underlying goal. Okay? I hope it's straightforward, and I hope it makes you more mindful of the conversations you're having with others. And that's all I got for you in this one. So baby mama says adios.